Hey everyone, it is week 7, and after you got a break from lecture materials last week as you took the exam, we're back to it. We're back to our regularly scheduled lectures, I suppose. It's also been a while since I have been in the old recording chair here because the last time you got lecture materials from me, it was week 4, and so 3 weeks have gone by at this point. As you can see here, we're going to look at a period of time known as the Enlightenment, and specifically look at some of the ideas that come about in Europe at this time, and a little bit of the art. Now, sort of an interchangeable term with the word Enlightenment is the Age of Reason, and we are going to take a look at this period of time, known as the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment, and take a look at 2 artistic styles that developed during that time, Rococo and Neoclassicism. So when we talk about the Age of Enlightenment, the Enlightenment is considered the beginning of the modern era in Western history. Now, don't get confused. We'll eventually get to a particular moment in time where we'll be referring to modern art and modern philosophy and things of that nature. And that doesn't really come until sort of the late 19th century into the 20th century. But when we talk about a modern era, right, we've had the ancient era, we've had the medieval era, we've had the Renaissance, we've had the Baroque. We're now into what is sort of referred to as modern history, right? It took place in sort of a wibbly, wobbly, timey-wimey period that's a little difficult to pinpoint exactly. Essentially, it was somewhere between like 1750 and the 1800s. But you'll notice that some of the work we're going to look at, some of the art that we'll look at, and even some of the events for that matter, take place earlier than that. So this kind of overlaps the tail end of the Baroque, and it's going to sort of coexist towards the end of its time with the neoclassical art that we'll look at in a bit. Excuse me. It was sparked by philosophers and scientists who believed in the power of reasoning, researching, and experimenting in order to learn or make decisions. In other words, they're looking toward science, logic, reason, and common sense. Now, their definitions of what that might be and ours might be different, but here's the thing. Right? We are arriving at a period of time in European history where many people, at least the intellectuals of the time, are beginning to really question things. Right? It sort of began with some of the experiments and things that we started talking about when we were mentioned Galileo Galilei and Sir Isaac Newton, who were trying to sort of see the mechanisms by which the universe worked, still believing that there was a God that put all that in place, but that God might want us to sort of discover what mechanisms that God put in place to make it all work. Right? But now we're arriving at a time where people are starting to no longer just accept the answer because God. Right? Like when questions about why do certain things work or not work? Why do we get certain reactions of chemicals? Why any of that? Right? If the answer is, well, because God did it, then we're arriving at a time where that starts to be questioned. And these philosophers sort of fall into 2 camps. There were the philosophers, who I think you're going to get some more information on from Professor McIntosh. They were sort of the social influencers, if you will, of their day. And they were specifically experimenting and trying to apply logic and reason to human social problems. And then there were the physiocrats. This was a group of economic influencers. They were philosophers who were trying to take science, logic, and reason and apply it to economic systems that could be put in place. Right? So rather than a purely feudalistic economy or whatever kind of economy that might have been in place, the economy of the aristocracy versus the peasant class, right? Are there other systems that perhaps we could put in place that would be, if not perfectly equal, maybe at least a little more egalitarian? This is what they're after. So interestingly, something happens at this particular moment in time. As a result of the excavations of the perfectly preserved ancient cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii earlier in the century, back in 1738 and 1748, respectively, there was this renewed interest in ancient Greek and Roman history. And there ends up being almost something very similar to what happened in the Renaissance, in that the Enlightenment thinkers and movers and shakers, what have you, look back to ancient Greece and particularly ancient Rome and sort of equate what they were doing as the height of morality. Right? They're ignoring a lot of stuff about both the Greek and Roman societies to sort of romanticize, if you will, the nature of them being these perfect moral societies. But again, very much like in the Renaissance, they begin to compare themselves to that. Also around this time, there are a couple of new camps when it comes to religion and sort of a view of how the universe works. There is deism and pietism, or in the United States, this was referred to as the Great Awakening. In the case of deism, deism was a belief that there is a God, yes, but this is a very Enlightenment way of thinking about things. That God is pure reason, right? And as such, is logical and is understandable, at least to some sort of extent. And that pure reason God created the universe, put all the mechanisms in place to get it turning and moving, and then just stood back and stayed out of it. Right? The idea of a deist God doesn't get itself involved in the world in which we live. But because that God is pure reason, and that pure reason God created all of this stuff that was set in motion, brought the human beings into the world, and because we are capable of pure reason, there start to be these this ideology that if we're all capable of that pure reason, perhaps we should all be equal, right? And so in the United States, interestingly, many of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence and eventually the Constitution were deists. And pietism is actually kind of, not the opposite, but it's a different type of spiritual movement. Pietism, or in the United States, the First Great Awakening, is this movement toward revival in Christian denominations. And actually, many new denominations pop up during this time. There's the idea that those early Protestant sects, like those of Martin Luther and John Calvin and others of their ilk, hadn't gone far enough to sort of shake off Catholicism. And so there was this a wish for a return to perhaps more literal interpretations of the Bible, more insistence upon the Bible itself. And we get groups out of this, like we get denominations out of this, like the Methodist denomination, Baptist denomination. Those start to happen during the Great Awakening in the United States. But there's also pietism in Europe, so there are similar kinds of things that are going on. Also, during this time, a lot of the countries of Europe really become solidly independent states, right? With good borders that look very similar to how they look today. The notion of a nation being sovereign begins to become a thing, right? As a nation, right, that we are sovereign, and another nation, another sovereign nation, shouldn't be able to sort of come over here and just take us over. And this leads to the idea of nationalism, right? The idea that one can be proud of the nation that one comes from. In France and in Britain as well, the aristocracy come to regain prominence. I know that's not something we've talked a whole lot about. Aristocracy were this particularly wealthy class. They're not necessarily of royal birth, but they are wealthy and extremely powerful, and they might as well be the ones sort of governing things for all the amount of power they have gotten and their sway over those who would be in the monarchy. But there's also this growing middle class that comes up at this particular moment in time. In France, it's referred to as the bourgeois. This middle class, they're not super ridiculously uber wealthy like the aristocracy or the royal family, for that matter. And they're not struggling like the peasants. They're doing okay for themselves, right? And that little middle group had always kind of been fairly small. We get into the 1700s, however, and that middle class starts to grow and become larger. And again, in France, they're referred to as the bourgeois. And suddenly the bourgeois and their ways of life and their ways of thinking about the world also become something that must be contended with, right? No longer can we just sort of depend upon what the royal family and the aristocracy think and let them sort of rule over and make decisions for everybody else. This growing middle class is starting to develop some power of its own. And this was the era of many political revolutions, such as the American Revolution and the French Revolution. A lot of this is sparked by Enlightenment ideology. I already sort of dived into how a lot of that Enlightenment ideology affected the American Revolution, but we're going to also see how that affects the French Revolution as well. And during this particular period of time, we have two prevailing art styles. We have an art style that we'll dive into momentarily, referred to as the Rococo, and one that will come a bit later, referred to as Neoclassicism. And these two art styles could not be any different from one another, could not be any more different from one another, that is. These two are going to be establishing themselves as diametrically opposed to one another. So here it's a map here of Europe in the 18th century. Let me get my laser pointer going. And as we look around the continent, as I said, a lot of places are starting to look like we recognize them today. France pretty much looks like it does today. Spain and Portugal, those are the borders to this day. Great Britain is shored up here. Our Scandinavian countries up here, right? What's referred to as the United Provinces, were Holland. They'll eventually be the Netherlands. Interestingly, the Ottoman Empire over here is still pretty influential. The Ottoman Empire sort of sprung up in the 1400s and is still holding on strong. And it has control of what would now be the Turkish peninsula and Greece. as well as some other sort of Eastern European areas. Right? But then here in the middle, I mean, Switzerland's a little bigger than this. Oh, well, before I get to the middle, yeah, Switzerland's a little bigger than this now. Italy hasn't quite become one united, independent nation. You see, we still have a lot of those smaller city-states and kingdoms and things of that nature that are still happening in Italy. But up here, we still have what's left, the smallest little vestiges of the Holy Roman Empire that are remaining. And at this point, man, it is only holy, it is only Roman, it is only an empire in name and name alone, because at this point, it's just what would eventually become Germany and Austria. Those are sort of incorporated in what barely remains of the Holy Roman Empire. But so this is kind of like, you can see Europe becoming a lot more stable than it has been in past periods of time that we're talking about. Then, we need to kind of go back in time a bit here. I was just talking about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Mount Vesuvius erupted. The state gets argued about because there was a Roman writer who wrote about this. Sorry, named Pliny the Elder. And Pliny the Elder wrote 2 different dates. And so it gets argued about. But August 24th, or as long as you just sort of know August, it happened in August of 79 CE. Right? That's when Mount Vesuvius erupted here. And this map sort of shows the way that the plume of lava and ash sort of spilled out where it sort of, the direction that it was sort of blown. Here you see the area of Italy that we're looking at. And all these cities that were then within that were covered completely in ash, lava, things of that nature, and were lost to history. As I said earlier on, however, in the 1730s, 1740s, Herculaneum over here and Pompeii were rediscovered during what were really the early days of archaeology. It was really only just becoming a science. They were unearthed, and this allowed for the first time for us to see some nearly untouched ruins of ancient Roman cities. Right? Because, granted, right, we've kind of talked about it before. The ancient Roman ruins were all over Europe. I mean, they're still standing in Europe today, but they're falling apart. They were falling apart in the 1700s. Right? And we didn't really have any way to know what they might have looked like in their heyday. Right? Archaeologists have sort of recreated some of that stuff today. But at the time, we didn't really have any way of really knowing. And so this gave us our first glimpse, because the ash sort of falling onto Herculaneum and Pompeii sealed them off and kept them then from being exposed to the elements for all the almost thousands of years since the time that they had been buried. It also gave us some of our first glimpses of what, other than in writing, what everyday Roman life would have been like. Now, these 2 things here are mosaics. And of course, we had lots of mosaics that survived the Roman Empire, that survive into this day. But the ones in Herculaneum and Pompeii specifically are really well preserved. So we could see the vibrancy of the colors. That was one thing that had not been, that people had not been able to see. But also, many of these mosaics focused on what daily life in the cities was like. And so we got this little bit of a glimpse of that we hadn't had before. Also, we know for a fact that the ancient Romans had artists who painted. There are plenty of writings about that, but very, very limited amounts of ancient Roman painting had survived. We had some in Herculaneum and Pompeii. And so we got to see how the artists, the painters of ancient Rome approached the depictions of human beings, of clothing, things of that nature. Right? And this is going to spark some interest in sort of recreating some of this in the neoclassical art that we'll study at a later point. And you may already be familiar, I don't know, with the fact that in Pompeii, because the ash descended and covered that city so quickly that there were many people and animals and things that were not able to get away and got buried under the ash. And then as their bodies sort of decomposed, as bodies do, left these open spaces in the ground that then formed on top, that these archaeologists were then able to pour plaster into and then get to see these impressions of the humans and animals and things that had been trapped under the ash of Mount Vesuvius. And so it's this particular discovery, these 2 particular discoveries, that are going to launch a renewed interest in particularly ancient Rome, but people are going to also look back at ancient Greece. Now, but understand, this is going to have a much greater effect on the bourgeois and on neoclassicism. And we're going to look first at the Rococo. It was, as I wrote right there, the art of the aristocracy, the Rococo. Now, I always have to get into this at least a little bit. I struggle whenever I get to this particular artistic style. I'm not a huge fan of the Rococo for reasons that I'll touch on as we get into it. And when last you and I were together, back when we were talking about the Baroque, I told you just how much I absolutely love that stuff, and I get extremely super excited when I talk about it. I have to try to keep some of my feelings about this at bay, so that when I'm talking about it, I'm not constantly talking about it in a pejorative sense. But also, as we'll learn as we dive into this lecture, it's not as if the Rococo is just, it's not as if I'm the only one, or it's not as if modern day sensibilities don't particularly care for the Rococo. It was criticized and reviled by certain groups, even in its own time. But rather, when I hear the reasons they are lobbying at Rococo for why it is amateurish or why it shouldn't be accepted as art, they're even going to go so far as to call it unnatural, as you'll see later on down the road. I find myself in the odd position of wanting to put my dukes up and defend Rococo, because I think that the reasons that it was criticized in its day and time are wrong. So keep that in mind, right? If every now and then, as I'm going through this, I give a bit of a heavy sigh like that, it's because I don't enjoy discussing the Rococo. But when we get to the criticisms of it in its time, I am going to come to its defense of that. So Rococo, also referred to sometimes as the late Baroque, is an 18th century artistic movement and style which affected several aspects of the arts, including painting, sculpture, architecture, interior design, decoration. There was even Rococo literature and Rococo music and theater. And it is so called. The word Rococo is sort of based on the root word rocaille. It's a French word that means a pebble. And it is indicative of sort of the small stones and shells that were used to decorate grotto interiors. It is indicative of, the term Rococo is indicative of the more decorative nature of the Rococo versus, again, if we kind of go back to the Baroque, even the Renaissance before it, where art was taken as a much more serious undertaking, and the work that was created wasn't necessarily seen as just pure decoration. Although we started to get into a little bit of that in the Rococo. Here, decoration. This kind of work is pretty much meant for decoration. It developed in the early part of the 18th century in France as a reaction against the grandeur, symmetry, and the strict regulations. The strict regulations of the Baroque. They are the characteristics that we can sort of see in Rococo. It's setting itself up as the antithesis, if you will, of a lot of what we looked at in the Baroque. It is jovial. Jovial meaning happy-go-lucky, pleasant, right? That kind of tone. It's elaborate and graceful, right? And that puts itself at odds. It's a rejection of the Baroque darkness and seriousness and emotionality. Right? It is going to be highly ornate. Now, again, highly ornate. When we look back at Baroque architecture, there's certainly a big push toward ornate design there, and the Rococo hangs on to some of that. And some of what we saw perhaps happening in the artwork of Rubens, with the sort of like highly ornate stuff that he would do, some of that gets pulled in. But like the seriousness that we saw of the Italian Baroque artists, as well as Rembrandt up in the north, right? That sternness, that seriousness, and those expressions of very raw human emotion, not having that stuff. And again, as a rejection of the Baroque, we get creamy pastel-like colors. If you look at this image over here, right, we've got the pinks that are going on in the dress here. We've got pastel blues and pastel greens and gentle dappling of warm light coming in from the sun. And again, that's not something we saw happening, particularly in the Baroque. Right? This is a rejection of that. So the Rococo is going to, you hear me sort of go back and forth. It's going to take some of the things about the Baroque that it likes and hang on to those. But most of it it's going to reject. One of those things it sort of hangs on to is the asymmetrical designs in composition that we saw back with again Rubens, right? Rubens would have those compositions that sort of shove everything over to one side or up here, right? And you can see that again happening here, where in this particular painting, all of the action is taking place below this line right here. Right? And then even furthermore, if we sort of draw a diagonal line here, all of the action is really happening down here in this lower, almost 1/4 of the painting. It's a very asymmetrical design to sort of shove all the action into one area and have a lot of negative space. Very elaborately decorated and filled negative space, but negative space nonetheless. And we saw again in a lot of Baroque architecture a tendency toward curves and gold trim. The Rococo is going to love that. Rococo paintings often portrayed secular themes, specifically of the French aristocracy engaged in frivolity. whenever I think of that word, the frivolity, I think of Professor McGonagall in the Harry Potter movie saying frivolity. But these paintings are going to be the French aristocracy engaging in a bunch of sort of frivolous activities, and they will also often incorporate decorative, angelic scenes of putti and mythical figures. Now, there's a word there that I just said out loud, and you heard it, and you maybe wondered to yourself, what in the hell I'm talking about, a putti. Well, putti, which is a fun word to say, is the plural of the word puto with O. And puto, specifically in art, are little chubby baby angels. You've seen them. That's essentially they're like little cupids, right? Back in the Renaissance, when we looked at Raphael's work, man, that dude had little tiny pooty all over the place, right? They're little cute, pinchable, usually nude baby angels with wings, right? Those are those are pooty, and the Rococo is going to incorporate them quite a bit. Now, these subject matters that we're talking about here, and the Rococo style were counter to the ideas of French academic art, and they were often, as a result, dismissed as amateur art. Also, in the pejorative sense, were often referred to as the feminization of art. Because, understand, the Rococo, we'll dive into this much more in depth as we really look into the art, but there were many of these Rococo artists who were women, and many of the patrons, the ones who were buying the work, were women. And for the bourgeois, not so much for the aristocracy has some loosey-goosey ideas about male and female gender roles. I say loosey-goosey as compared to the bourgeois in France. We're in France, by the way. The bourgeois in France have a very conservative idea of very conservative roles for men, very conservative roles for women, and they don't like what they see happening with the aristocracy. And so it starts to be seen as this art form that is taking art and bastardizing it by making it feminine. Additionally, most Rococo paintings, sculpture, and interior design were exhibited in ladies' boudoirs, sitting rooms, and romantic love nests. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. But again, the much of the Rococo art is being commissioned by women. Many of the artists themselves are women. We'll really only look at one today. I wish I had time for more, but this lecture would just go on forever. And though again, women certainly in the aristocracy had a bit more power and a bit more self-agency, they still were not the ones in control of sort of the academic gallery spaces. They weren't the ones in control of sort of governmental policy about what is and is not art. So they had to display this work in the places that they had control over, and that was their boudoirs, their bedrooms, their bedchambers, their sitting rooms. These would be places where men and women could visit, but they were the domain of the women, and their love nests. We'll talk about that briefly in a moment. So, our first Rococo artist that we'll take a look at is Jean-Antoine Watteau. Born in 1684, dies in 1721. You can see that's a bit earlier than where we said the Rococo begins, right? He's already dying before 1750. But he's the beginning of it all, right? That's why I said this whole thing is really wibbly-wobbly. I don't always necessarily agree with some of the firm dates that art historians like to stick on things, because they love to do stuff like that right there. They love to say Rococo takes place between 1750 and about 1800. And by the way, one of the greatest Rococo artists was Jean-Antoine Watteau, who died in 1721. But he's the beginning. We're going to see, he's kind of like for the Baroque, he is pretty much what Caravaggio was. Right? He is going to launch the style that aristocratic women are particularly drawn to, and then other artists are going to begin sort of copying his style. He was 18th century French painter, highly influenced by Rubens. He was studying Rubens, and as I said, an early innovator of Rococo. He took his Baroque influences, infused with these new interests he had in color. He was starting to do some experiments with color that the Baroque artists weren't as interested in. And he starts applying these to scenes of bucolic and idyllic charm, right? The people out in nature enjoying themselves, the aristocracy, again, engaging in frivolity. He starts doing that, and he does so with a certain amount of theatrical flair. And as I said, the patrons of the aristocracy see this and, excuse me, and are drawn to it. They want this. And so, we get a painting like this one. This is perhaps one of Watteau's most famous, and it's called A Pilgrimage to Cythera. All right, let's talk about this. Let's take a look at this painting from 1717 and see if we identify some of those characteristics that we were talking about. Right. So let's go back to our list of characteristics really quickly. Maybe I should have done it like this. All right. Jovial, elaborate, and graceful, highly ornate, creamy pastel-like colors, asymmetrical designs, curves, and gold trim. Those were the characteristics that we listed off. Let me pull that other slide back up. Right. So creamy pastel-like colors. Definitely. We have pinks, we have pastel blues, we have pastel greens, we have pastel yellows, right? There's almost no black in this. If there's any, there's small dabbles. So they're very much getting away from the approach, if you will, of the Baroque artists. They're not interested in that sort of emerging out of darkness. They want the color. We certainly have an asymmetrical design. Right? All the action is pretty much happening below this line. And then we can sort of draw another line that's been made by this tree right here. And now the action has been relegated to an even smaller portion of this canvas. Let me go back to our characteristics again. Jovial, elaborate, and graceful. We had asymmetrical design. We had creamy pastel colors, highly ornate. All right, let's go back. Let's take a look. Hell yeah, that's highly ornate. Look at all this stuff. Look at this stuff, right? So much foliage, so much foliage. All of the mountains in the background. So much is happening within, where all the action is. There's so much happening in just a small little area. And it's jovial, certainly. Now, over here, right, we have some of those little pui that we were talking about. We have some mythical creatures. They seem to be the ones who have guided the boat here. And I said we're going to see the aristocracy engaged in frivolity. Well, we have the situation here, right? We have this group of people. We have a title, the pilgrimage to Cythera. It makes it feel like something particularly serious is happening, something particularly serious and important. All these people are gathering on this island. By the way, Cythera is an island. All these people have gathered on this island, and little baby angels have shown up to see them embark on this island. There were these mythical Greek and Roman figures that have sailed them here. It feels like there must be something huge and important happening. I mean, we even have a statue of Venus over here in the corner. And it feels like there must be something so important going on, and yet it's a picnic. And I mean, it's all it is. It's a picnic. It's a bunch of wealthy aristocrats who decided they wanted to have a picnic on the island of Cythera, and they sailed out here to do it. But Watteau paints it in a way that the aristocracy loves. Again, as I said, right, as if the gods themselves have come down to approve of this little outing. But here's the other thing that we get a lot in Rococo paintings. There's the frivolity, right? It's just a bunch of wealthy aristocrats enjoying a picnic, right? But there's also often a bit of veiled sensuality or sexuality within the images themselves. So I want to direct your attention to this little grouping here, right? This little grouping down here, they all seem to be embarking. They're all getting off the boat. They're running into and meeting and talking with people, and they go, this is all very pleasant down here. Up here, we have another group, right? Now, what is happening here? There might not, maybe to our modern 21st century eyes, and seeing people who are dressed up all fancified, if you will, we don't see anything out of the ordinary happening. There's nothing that immediately strikes us as odd, if you will. But what I want to bring your attention to, first off, like this entire group, there's also this little group right here, right? This little group, we have this young lady, and we have this dude right here, who clearly has some romantic leanings, if you will, toward this young lady right here, right? Clearly trying to seduce, trying to get a kiss, if you will, maybe even trying to convince her to go somewhere else out of sight with him. Now, it's the aristocracy, and as I said, the aristocracy certainly has some different ideas about the gender roles of male and female. Right? And women did have a little bit more agency than in the bourgeois, but they still needed to have chaperones. Like women, even in the aristocracy, young women, that is, not so much the married women, we'll talk about that later, but young women still needed their chastity, if you will, protected. And so they would often have older women who were their chaperones. They were there to sort of make sure she stayed out of trouble, chase away the dudes who might be coming after her. So where are her chaperones? Well, it looks as though this dude right here has brought himself 2 wingmen. He's got himself 2 wingmen, both of whom have seemingly successfully seduced her chaperones and are leading them away. Right? This lady hasn't yet gotten off the ground, but she's getting up. This lady here is being led away, and she's giving a glance back. She's looking at this. She knows that she should be over here taking care of the situation, right? But she's not. She's like, I should, but but this guy right here, like, I don't know, he's kind of hot. He was saying the right things. We're in this romantic setting on this island. She'll be okay, right? And so these 2 are taking away her 2 chaperones so that this dude and this lady right here can have some privacy. Granted, there's a little child that's also been inserted for humor's sake, but we can assume what's about to happen with these 2. We can definitely assume what's about to happen with these 4 over here. They're about to go have themselves a little tryst as well. And understand that would have been seen as humorous. Right? This would have been seen as a bit of humor. Like, I see what's happening here. Oh, this scamp is about to have his way with this young woman, and look at how clever he is. He got his 2 wingmen to take care of women who would have been the cock blockers, if you will, and they're taking them away to keep them away. Oh, that scamp. Oh, that But again, it's framed as if something so much more grand is happening, right? As I said, the goddess Venus herself, granted in statue form, but still, she is here to oversee it. All of these little putti and all of these other sort of mythical figures are over here to oversee this whole thing happening, and it's just a picnic where a bunch of people have come to this island to just like chill, have a picnic, get together, and we got like a little group up here who can't help but act upon their horniness. And that is what's passing for art. Again, the women of the aristocracy are the patrons. Many of the artists are women, although Watteau himself, of course, is not. And this is what they're looking for. This is what they want. Another artist, then, who's really firmly going to land in the period of the Rococo, and bring with it and bring with him many more of the themes that we sort of associate with the Rococo, is Jean-Henri Fragonard. Fragonard, born in 1732, died in 1806, was more of a late Rococo painter, and he's known, like Watteau, for his genre paintings of the aristocracy. Genre painting for I think I may have talked about this back in the Renaissance, but I might not have. So let me dive into it at least a little bit. A genre painting is just meant to be a painting of like everyday life. That's referred to as a genre painting. It was particularly a particularly famous genre of painting in Northern Europe, right, during the time of Rembrandt and artists of that ilk. He's going to bring that to the aristocracy. And again, you're going to see the aristocracy. He's going to give us depictions of hedonism, depictions of intimacy, not unlike what we saw happening with Watteau, and veiled eroticism, right, to an even greater extent than what we saw with Watteau. So there's this painting, which we already took at least a brief look at a moment ago. This is probably his most famous painting, The Swing, from 1766. And again, all of the Rococo elements are on display for us. We have an extremely ornate composition, stuff everywhere. Again, the bucolic nature of all of this foliage that's all over the place, right? The asymmetrical design of it off. Again, all the action happening down here, and we talked about if you kind of draw a line here, all the action's taking place in an even smaller portion of the painting. We have those creamy pastel colors. There's her like beautiful pastel pink dress. There are all these pastel greens and blues that surround them, right? These are creamy colors. There's very little black. These are creamy colors that the Baroque just didn't really make much use of. But it's Fragonard as well. And so we have, again, aristocracy engaging in frivolity. But if it's Fragonard, there's going to be something in there that is some, at least thinly veiled eroticism. Now, we look at this, again, in the 21st century, this doesn't feel erotic to us at all, but boy, would it have been in its time. Let me sort of walk you through some things. Oh, first, by the way, we have, again, a statue of Cupid up here, kind of a Puteaux, rather, a figure. So what do we have here? Well, we have this woman on the swing, but what is happening? She is on a swing, yes, right? But there's also this dude right here, right? And another dude back here. And again, a couple of statues of Puteaux who are onlookers. And so the scenario that we seem to have here, there's this man back here who seems to be some sort of member of the clergy, perhaps, who seems to be trying to help out his dude over here, right? Man, there's something about the Rococo and wingmen, man. So what this guy right here seems to have done, he is pulling on these two ropes that are attached to the swing. So he's pulling them in order to allow her to sort of swing forward and back. And again, he seems to be in cahoots with this dude right here, who is lying down in the bushes, hiding himself out and getting himself in the perfect position that when she swings up like she is right now, he gets himself a perfect little upskirt shot, right? That's what he's down here for. He wants to see what is happening up in there, right? Now, but and as predatory as that might seem to us, look at the body language. Look at the body language, right? She has been portrayed as being very aware he's down there. She's giving him a look like, okay, yeah, no, I know you're down there. I know what you're up to, and she has even kicked off her shoe. The shoe is going to go flying. The implication is she's kicked it off so that the guy down there who's not being particularly all that great of a gentleman right now can go be a gentleman, go hunt down her shoe and bring it back to her and return it to her and court her properly. But in this particular moment, both of them are engaged in this sexy moment, if you will, right? Where this man is completely objectifying her and has done so with help of this guy back here. But there's a certain impish pleasure that she's taking from it. Like, she knows what he's up to, and she's watching, right, and kicking his shoe off. And this may be a bit more innocent, if you will, than some of Fragonard's stuff, and we'll get to that in a moment. But still, it's odd to me sometimes to think that the women of the aristocracy were the ones commissioning a lot of this work, because oftentimes women are treated as absolute objects in these paintings. And as another great example of that, I present to you a painting painted in 1776, 79-ish, somewhere in there, called The Lock. And, boy. Right, now, maybe this one gets a bit away from the creamy pastel color scheme, although there's a little bit of that. There's certainly an asymmetrical composition, right? The main action is happening down here, this area. And it is the aristocracy engaged in, I'll put it in quotations this time, frivolity. But perhaps to our 21st century eyes, this feels a little more icky and a little less humorous, as it would have been meant in its time. Because what we seem to have here, we have this scene before us where we are in a lady's bedchamber. This is, and she is in her bedclothes. She was clearly here asleep, and this man, also in his bedclothes, has just entered her bedchamber, obviously mad for love, if you will, and has snatched her out of the bed, has closed the door behind him, and is reaching up to lock the door. We know why. We know why that he is reaching out to lock the door. He is locking that door so that no one who might be outside this bedchamber could come in and interrupt what is about to happen in this bedchamber. But look at her body language. She's reaching for that lock herself. She's in a position of resistance. We, depending on how consent has been ascertained here, we are looking at a potential sexual assault. Again, this would have been seen as humorous at the time. This, again, would have been a piece that would have been commissioned by, most likely, a woman, and would have been in either her boudoir or her love nest. We'll dive into that in a bit here. But this would have been meant to be humorous, right? Because it's like, oh, I see what he's doing. Oh, he's locking the door. That scamp. You see what he is up to. And I see what she's doing too, right? She's reaching up. She's putting a little bit of resistance up. But if you look at her face, right, there's a sense that she is putting up the expected resistance, right? She is putting up the resistance she is supposed to as a lady. But it's more of a, oh no, please stop, no, don't kind of thing, right? There's visual language that she's putting up some resistance, but that resistance is only going to last so long, and that it's only obligatory resistance. And I see that, and that would have been seen as humorous as well, right? That would have been like, oh, yep, I see. No, she's acting like she doesn't want it. And we all know she does want it, doesn't she? She wants it. And once he gets that door locked, man, are they going to have some wild times on that bed right there? That kind of, I don't know. This is what I struggle with. I struggle with Rococo because, again, it is trying to portray the everyday goings on of a culture I struggle to understand, and a culture that is often treating women in a way that I struggle to understand. And I also struggle to understand how it was that women would be the ones who were the patrons of stuff like this, because so often they're treated very poorly in this work. But again, at this time, right, the Rococo was often referred to by its critics as a feminizing of art. This is, again, as a pejorative. This isn't meant to be a positive. Right? They're saying that art has become women's stuff when you talk about the Rococo. So we're going to look at the Rococo, a group of women referred to as the Saulniers, women patrons of this artwork, and women artists themselves in 18th century France. So let's first talk about, the salons. And you'll note here that I put in parentheses a private gallery. That is to differentiate this type of salon from the official sort of state-sanctioned salons that we'll talk about at a later point. So in this context, the word salon refers to gatherings in the homes of wealthy aristocrats in and around Paris that were held at regularly scheduled intervals. At these salons, there were intellectual topics that were discussed, like science, mathematics, philosophy, art, etc. They were overseen by a woman referred to as a Saulnier. She was the lady, or madam, French, of course, of the house. She was the lady of the house. She was married to the one who owned the house. And the Saulniers became very influential in the development of the Rococo. They were often nearly as powerful as their male counterparts. And at a time when society was defined and regulated almost completely by men, women could be a more powerful influence in these salons. These Saulniers would select the guests, they would choose the topics of discussion, they juried the art exhibitions, and they mediated the debates that would happen. So, and understand, because these are happening in places that women controlled, and women at this time in France could not attend academies and universities, many ambitious women of the time used the salons to pursue a form of higher education. So the Saulniers, again, lady of the house, she would send out invitations, right? So what this would happen, right? There would be a salon at a Saulnier's house. Again, it would take place in the places that she herself had control over in the house. So generally her sitting room. Right? And she would decide on topics that would be discussed, and she would put out invitations to speakers in the fields that she was interested in talking about that day. Come and speak, and then she put out invitations to both men and women. Right? We're going to have this is the scientific discussion that we will have. Here's what art we'll be looking at. Here are the philosophical ideas that we'll be debating. Come and enjoy. And then everyone would show up at the appointed date and time, and a very intellectual discussion would happen at the salon. And again, as I mentioned, many women, as a result, were able to sort of use this as an informal university. The Saulniers had a certain amount of power, and again, the artwork that would have been on the walls of their boudoirs, of their sitting rooms, of their love nests, would have been Rococo art. So this art, they might have their new painting that they just had commissioned, and that might be on display, and that would be discussed as well. Right? So a lot of this artwork that we've been looking at in the Rococo was discussed and viewed. It was not meant for the gallery spaces. It was meant first and foremost for spaces like this. And This painting here by Francois Boucher in 1750 of a particularly well-known Saulnier, Madame de Pompadour. If we want to understand the kind of position that the Saulniers had at this time, a good way of ascertaining that is to look at how they chose to have themselves represented. So here it is, Madame de Pompadour, and let me get my laser pointer back. Right, and again, very Baroque. Look at this. Look at all these pastel colors. Look at this asymmetrical composition. Right, she is sort of pushed down here. And how has she chosen to present herself? Well, certainly, she wants us to see her as feminine. Right, she has had Boucher paint her in this very lovely floral green and pink dress that we would associate with femininity. Right, she doesn't seem to want to hide that away. But she does not have herself presented as just an object to be stared at. She is not meant to be a sexual. She is not meant to be a sexual object, an object of just pure lustful desire. How has she presented herself instead? Now, she certainly seems to be in her boudoir. Right, she is here, kind of lying on a couch or bed with lots of pillows and cushions. There is a mirror behind her, by the way, which is why we can sort of see her head reflected there. And what is she doing? She's in her boudoir, but she's reading a book. And it has dropped. Her hand, we can imagine, was just up here. She was reading, and her hand is just now sort of dropped, and her eyes are sort of looking off into the distance, as if she's just read something that has given her a moment of pause. Right? Surely, at least I hope, at some point in your life you have had that experience where you read something, or if you weren't reading something, maybe you saw something in a film, what have you, that gave you a moment where you had to stop and sort of think about what you had just taken in. Right? And so she has a moment here. She's got to think about this, what she's just read. She wants us to see her as a thinking woman. She is educating herself, and she's having a moment to pause and think about what she has just read. And over here on this table, we have a candle, and we have all the accoutrement one needs for writing. So not only is she educating herself, she's also a woman who writes stuff, whether they're letters or whether they're her invitations to her salons, or whether she's writing instructional stuff. Who knows? But the point seems to be that we notice that she is a writer of some sort, as well as we have this mirror. It's sort of serving two functions. One is it's showing us that on the other side of the room there is this bookshelf with lots and lots of books in it. Right? That suggests that she's a smart lady as well. But also, just in case anyone should think that she was staring across at some dude who had just entered her chambers, we got this mirror that's letting us know there's no one else here. Right? There's no dude out here in this room who has come in here looking for a romantic tryst. Right? She is spending some time alone, reading, learning, thinking. She's even been accompanied by a little dog down here, who again suggests that she is a faithful wife to her husband. Now, whether or not Madame de Pompadour actually was, that's beside the point. She at least wants herself presented as such. Then here we have, this is a room that we find in the Frick collection in New York City. It's been moved there from its original home in or around Paris. This is a room that is meant to represent what a lady's love nest of this time would have looked like. And it is decorated by lots of Boucher paintings, and he did some of the interior design, right? All the curves and the gold, the circular shaped compositions, things of that nature. Right? This, again, is the kind of place where this was the ultimate destination of Rococo art. It wasn't meant for the galleries. It wasn't meant for royalty. The bourgeois certainly were not interested in this stuff. And so it wasn't getting sort of official recognition in France because it was being displayed in a woman's place, the spaces that women had control over, like a love nest. Now, what did I say? I said I would eventually get around to talking about what a love nest is. So the aristocracy had some loosey-goosey, if you will, ideas about how monogamy worked. Right? Yes, a man and a woman would marry, and in that relationship, the man is supposed to be sort of considered the lord of the house, if you will, and the lady is secondary to him. She is subservient. However, it was extremely common that men of the aristocracy, aristocratic men, would, when building their homes or their palaces or what have you, would build onto it a space referred to as the love nest. And that love nest was a room meant for his wife to entertain gentlemen callers. This was the place where she would have her lovers. As long as she kept it in that particular room, everything was okay. Now, perhaps, again, in your 21st century way of thinking, we might think to ourselves, why in the world would some dude build onto his house a place for his wife to go and have sex with other men? Well, it was just sort of expected that's going to happen, right? Marriages were usually business and or political deals, right? They weren't done for love. They were done to sort of keep money in the family. I guess I should point that out. They were economic deals also. they were done to keep money in the family. They were done to keep certain businesses going. They were done as a means of land deals. They weren't done for love. And so it was just sort of understood. We're not necessarily attracted to or in love with one another, right? As long as you're giving me babies, cool. You can go and have your fun with the men that you are attracted to. And I, the husband, am probably sneaking out every now and then to the love nest of some other dude's wife anyway, right? So that's when I say there were sort of like loose ideas of monogamy. But then again, like you can understand, right? If the bourgeois is very conservative minded, right, and have very, very strict ideas about the male and female roles that should be played out, you can see why this, the fact that art, right, is being displayed in a place like this to them feels wrong. And that stuff is just pure decoration. It's smut, it's porn, and it's stuff made for women, by women, right? That is just amateurish stuff. And that was sort of the criticism that were lobbed at it at its time. And speaking of Rococo artists who were women, perhaps one of our most famous would be Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun. Struggle with her name a bit there. Vigée-Lebrun, born in 1755, died in 1842. And her style is generally considered Rococo, but it also shows some interest in neoclassical painting. She would later in her life do some work that was very much leaning toward neoclassicism. But she was never considered a pure neoclassicist, however, since she created mostly portraits rather than history paintings. We'll get into what all that means when we get to the actual neoclassical. Now, she's working for the royal family. She was sort of like a court painter for the royal family at this time. And as I was just saying, there are revolutions that happen at this point in time. There was the American Revolution. There was the French Revolution. When the French Revolution happens, it is very, very dangerous to be a royal, to be an aristocrat, or to be associated with them. So after the arrest of the royal family during the French Revolution, Lebrun had to get the hell out of France. She and her very young daughter fled, and she eventually sort of lands in Rome, where her paintings were met with great critical acclaim. She becomes very famous in Rome. And it gets elected to what was called the Roman Accademia di San Luca, something like that. I hope I'm getting that pronounced correctly. I'll say she becomes very famous, but in her early time, she is working with the royal family who is much malaligned at this time by the angry masses who are going through revolutionary fervor. This is her painting of Marie Antoinette with her children, Marie Antoinette. You may recall, if you had any sort of history of France back in high school, she was the queen at the time, and many of the revolutionists sort of vilified her in particular. And right, one of the most famous lines everybody talks about is her, the line that was attributed to her. She probably never actually said it. Of when she was approached by a page who says, Your Majesty, the people are starving. What are they supposed to eat if we don't release more food stores to them? And she says, let them eat cake, right? Whether or not she ever actually said that, that story is indicative of how people felt about her. They felt about her like they felt about the aristocracy, that she and they had become completely disconnected with what the everyday people of France thought, believed, held dear to their hearts. And so here we have Lebrun performing a little bit of propaganda here, trying to help perhaps people to see Marie Antoinette as not that villain that they see her as, but rather a mother who loves her children, who has her children gathered in closely to her and has this connection with touch and sort of endearing looks and things of that nature. Right? She wants us to see that because that kind of visual language, this familial connections, would have appealed to the bourgeois and the revolutionists. So she's trying to take advantage of that here and present her not as this haughty, holier-than-thou figure who has no idea how hard it is for the masses who are starving, but rather someone who's just like you. This is also particularly interesting because, again, it is a painting that really could only be done by a woman. Because the royal family, perhaps, is a little less loosey-goosey with their gender roles than the aristocracy. And so there's still some rules in place that a woman's private chambers shouldn't be entered by a man other than her husband. This is in the case of the royalty. Because if a man is entering her chambers, he is doing so for one reason and one reason only. He has sex on the mind, right? And so Vigée-Lebrun here is a woman, and ergo can be allowed into her private chambers, which clearly is what we're seeing here. These are her private chambers. Her children are here, right? If a man had painted this, that would have seemed scandalous. She's a woman. She can be here, and there's no sense of impropriety because she is there. That makes this painting in particular one that this particular scene, her and her children, and the intimacy that we see here, quite possibly comes from that familiarity with Vigée-Lebrun that she would not have had. Right? Decorum would have suggested she couldn't be like this with a man in her room. Then we'll take a look at what I was talking about, the criticisms that were sort of lobbed at Rococo at the time that it was current. And we'll take a look at two of its critics, William Hogarth and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, again, the criticisms that these two are going to be lobbing at it, are what I bristle at, right? For me, as I said before, my reason that I struggle a bit with the Rococo is more about the subject matter being something that I struggle to take seriously. And again, the way women are often treated in Rococo art, I struggle with that. And it makes it hard for me to look at that work and get excited to talk about it in serious terms. And that's my own hang up. I don't want any of you to ever think that you should not like the Rococo because this old 45-year-old fart who struggles with it says he doesn't like it, right? I would never for a moment try to judge you for liking any of what you've just seen or any other Rococo art that we haven't had a chance to look at. You should absolutely enjoy the art that you enjoy. I would never discourage that, okay? Understood. But when we get to the criticisms of people like William Hogarth and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they're going to be making some arguments that I have a little more trouble getting behind. William Hogarth maybe a little bit more, but you'll see. All right, so William Hogarth. He was a British painter, born in 1697 and died in 1764. And he was a British painter, but he was also kind of a satirist. He made humorous paintings. And he did a whole series referred to as Marriage a la Mode. This particular one that we're looking at is Morning Party. This particular painting from the collection known as Marriage a la Mode that he painted between 1743 and 47. And this was a series of paintings that criticized the aristocracy and criticized Rococo. Interestingly, though, he does a pretty decent job of mimicking the Rococo style. I mean, look at this painting. It's a very asymmetrical design. All the action's kind of happening down here. The colors are very Rococo in nature. And at a cursory glance, one would be it would be very excusable, rather, for one to mistake what they were looking at for a Rococo painting. However, it is meant to be a critique, not only of the Rococo, but of the aristocracy and their way of life that has produced it. So you see things like, okay, over here in this corner, we have this woman and this man, engaged in conversation, engaged with their hands, nearly touching one another. He is in, I mean, come on, guys. You're all in college, right? You know the stance of a lecturing professor who is just way deep into lecture, right? He is pointing and gesturing at this thing back here that he is lecturing on. At least I think Hogarth would be suggesting he is at least feigning to have an intellectual conversation about because he's lying down on this couch. And there is, again, this lady here. Now, where are they? They are in her bedroom. There's the bed back there. And the curtains of the bed have been parted. So the suggestion is, because this is called Morning Party, that these two over here have probably just had a tryst in there overnight, and it is now the morning after their little tumble in the sheets the night before. This is a lady of the house. This is her lover. But now, Hogarth is pointing out, in his mind at least, how crazy it is that then all these people are hanging out in this room with this woman here and this man, and we're all going to just act like and pretend like he didn't just the night before blink her right back there, right? Like we're just all going to hang out and act like everything's cool and fine and pretend that we're discussing intellectual topics. That's his critique of this kind of stuff that I was just talking about earlier. Now, whether it's a fair critique or not, it is coming from a place of a man who belongs to what would be sort of the British middle class, right? And who sees that way of life as being unnatural. And over here, we have her husband. Now, let me sort of give you a closer view of this. This over here is her husband. Now, he's got all these horns sticking out of his head. Why? Well, he's a husband whose wife has been sleeping around on him. And the term for that, we still use it to this day, is that he is a cuckold, right? The term cuckold, it comes from sort of a superstition, if you will, that when a man's wife has slept with another man, has been unfaithful to him, he grows a horn. He becomes cuckolded by growing horns that he himself cannot see, but others who see him do see and know that his wife has been sleeping around him. It's a very patriarchal way of thinking about it. But again, Hogarth is trying to be funny here, and look at just how many horns this poor guy has on his head. This poor guy who's just like sitting in sipping his tea like nothing's going on. There's no problem. Right? He has been through this many times. But then also, right, this is a criticism of the aristocracy. It's a criticism of the wealthiest class. And look at just how goofy he has painted everyone. Everyone is so cartoonishly painted. These are caricatures. Really, the only person who isn't given that kind of treatment is this woman right here herself. But even up above, there are these paintings that are meant to sort of be joking versions of Rococo paintings. Like in each one of them, I'll let you sort of take a closer look at them yourself. Excuse me, there's a little something weird happening in every one. And then over here, right, we have a portrait of this very dude right here in her love nest. Oh, Hogarth. But again, this is coming from a very patriarchal thing, right? The middle class, they're all sort of rising up. And they want they want to start exercising some of that power. Who is in power? The aristocracy. So we have to set up the aristocracy as the villain, as the enemy. And so we need to vilify the things that they do. And a great one who did this was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was an 18th century writer and intellectual who saw the recent gains in power and influence of women as being specifically unnatural. Now, understand, Rousseau is someone that, if you are looking at sort of European history, if you're looking at particularly French history, he is an important intellectual whose ideas and work are very much sort of the precursors of what's going to happen in the French Revolution. And so you'll often hear him sort of mentioned in other aspects, right? Because it's his ideas and things that he writes down that lead to that. I'm not talking about that stuff necessarily. I'm specifically going to talk about how he felt about women and how that then leads to his critique of the aristocracy and Rococo art. But he saw those recent gains in women as being unnatural and being detrimental to the values of the burgeoning middle class, the bourgeois. The bourgeois had what Rousseau referred to as natural roles for men and women that were based in ancient Greek and Roman models. And his argument was that women, their natural place was in the domestic sphere, in the home, and they should be in submissive roles, specifically to their fathers when they're children, and to their husbands once they are married, and that men, their natural places in the public sphere, outside the home, laboring or pursuing intellectual pursuits. Right? These, again, are based on old Roman models and interpretations and misinterpretations of some of the things that St. Paul wrote in his letters in the New Testament. But let's think about, at least briefly, some of those things that Paul writes about when he does write about women, right? He says things along the lines of, when he's writing to churches who are asking him, like, what are we supposed to do? Like, how do we worship in our church? How do we organize what happens in the church? And he says things along the lines of, as far as I'm concerned, women shouldn't speak during church. And if they have a question about something, rather than speaking out during the service, they should first quietly ask their husband. If he approves, maybe they can speak up, or maybe he can ask on her behalf. And again, there are interpretations and misinterpretations of that get sort of applied to how women should be treated. But understand, Paul was a Roman citizen. And so a lot of that way of thinking was framed by a culture that he belonged to, the Roman culture, who had very specific ideas and roles that women were meant to play and that men were meant to play, and that no one was really meant to cross over into the other's territory. He saw Rococo art, the private salons and saloniers, as being absolutely immoral. And he is the one who coined that term, the feminization of art. Why is he saying that's immoral? Well, because again, if the natural roles of men and women are meant to be in the domestic sphere, men are meant to be in the public sphere, and again, recall, at this point, art is considered something you go and get training for at universities and things of that nature. It is considered man's work at this particular time, and that then seems like it should be the job of a man. A man should be the one going out and making the work, and the man should be the one buying the work and commissioning it, and the art should be made for the man's desires and preferences, right? Women are supposed to be at home, taking care of the home, taking care of the children. They are the domestic sphere. And so if they are putting themselves in positions like the saloniers of actually trying to educate people, that's stepping into men's territories. If they are purchasing art, that's in men's territory. And if some of those artists are women themselves, and worse than that, they are women making art that has been commissioned and being purchased by women, that is unnatural, immoral. What are these women doing? What the hell do they think they're doing, encroaching on men's territory? That is unnatural. They have gone outside the natural order. That is wrong. That is immoral. And they are taking art and turning it into just tripe that is women's work. That's this asshole Rousseau's words, not mine. Right? He's pointing to this stuff and saying, not only, as I was saying, is it just meh, I'm saying it's mess, it's meh art, and it's perhaps problematic. Perhaps it's a bit classist of me. I don't know, that to see like wealthy individuals just sort of going about their frivolous lives, that bugs me. That kind of thing, right? It's not that. He's saying, no, this stuff is immoral, and it is specifically immoral because those crazy aristocrats don't know the place of a woman and the place of a man, and they have made a mockery of it all. That I can't get behind. I put my dukes up and I'll defend it against that. Right? I have no problem with Rococo being an art form that was by women for women. I like the fact that the saloniers figured out a way to create, at the very least, an informal education system for women. And I can't get behind Rousseau's ideas here. But Rousseau, again, is an intellectual whose other ideas that he's writing about are voicing how the bourgeois feels at this time. And the bourgeois may not be as hardcore about those gender roles as Rousseau might suggest here, but they live in a culture like that. And if this way of thinking helps to vilify the aristocracy and make this revolution happen, they're going to grab onto it. And the French Revolution, and the art style that becomes sort of the official art style of the French Revolution, neoclassicism, is what we'll talk about in part 2. I'll see you there.